So we have our next speaker, Garrett Flynn from University of Southern California, who will be talking about stakeholder perspectives on cognitive effects of brain stimulation. The floor is yours, Garrett.
All right, yeah, thank you. So as some of you might know, brain stimulation devices are increasingly used to treat neurological and psychiatric conditions. We have things like deep brain stimulation for Parkinson's disease, transcranial direct current stimulation for depression, motor brain-computer interfaces to restore the function of lost limbs. And the lab that I work at USC is developing a memory prosthesis for the treatment of dementia to restore memory encoding. And regardless of whether the intended effect of the device is to modify cognition, there tends to be unintended changes to language, memory, and other cognitive processes that is understudied and underreported by both patients, caregivers, and healthcare providers. So the goal of this literature review was to characterize the cognitive effects of brain stimulation in previous literature. So we conducted a PubMed database search for qualitative studies on brain stimulation. This ended up returning about 10,000 articles. We screened most of these in the titles and abstracts, had about 76 full texts, included about 41, which comprised 36 total data sets. And we found about 15 papers from 14 data sets that did include mention of cognitive effects. So this was sourced by sort of a primary search on brain stimulation with the conditions of perspectives, opinions, views, interviews, and qualitative. And then we just conducted a secondary search to make sure that we caught all these specific devices. So that would include responsive neurostimulation, transcranial direct current stimulation, all of the others I had mentioned previously. So some examples of the returned articles included patients with obsessive compulsive disorder who had mentioned, for instance, yes, I can pay attention somewhat better when I have the deep brain stimulation device, somewhat better at focusing at the task at hand or at music while playing in a band because normally distracted with my thoughts, and then I could not follow the story anymore. And so as an example of the way we code this article, this is an actual effect experienced by somebody who has a deep brain stimulation device. To some extent, cognition is restored to sort of a baseline level before the disorder. And it's a general cognitive question. So it's in response to something that the researchers had asked. It's not sort of spontaneously reported by this patient. On the other hand, we do also have examples of healthcare providers who were asked about a speculative neurotechnology. So when asked whether it would be ethical to provide surgical and memory enhancement, if a patient should request it, 48.6% of respondents said it would not be ethical. And so this is an expected effect from healthcare providers who are asked about enhancing cognition. And this was specifically about a cognitive enhancement question directed at these healthcare providers. And so going through the 14 data sets that we did have, we found that patient-reported cognitive effects or expectations were present in about 7 of 14 data sets. And only one of these 7 data sets was sourced by asking patient about such effects. So this means that most of the patient-reported cognitive effects were just spontaneously given by a patient. It's not something that the researchers were specifically looking for. And these responses, which generally were from patients with Parkinson's disease, were largely negative. So they were cognitive effects that were detrimental to the patient's well-being. On the other hand, provided reported cognitive effects or expectations were present in about 5 of the 14 data sets, and 4 of these data sets asked providers directly about cognitive enhancement. So there seems to be a pretty big focus on sort of speculative devices or devices that could restore function beyond some degree of baseline. And this is sort of incongruous with the actual patient-reported cognitive effects that exist. So what this generally shows is a current reliance on healthcare provider perspectives, which leads to underreported negative cognitive effects for patients and lack of understanding about the patient perspective on early stage devices and the possibility of cognitive enhancement from these. So we don't know what patients would even want from such devices if they have any concerns, and whether we might focus our resources on more conventional like symptom management rather than sort of these more speculative devices. And to address these problems, we suggest that future neurostimulation studies should more consistently and rigorously evaluate such patient perspectives on potential cognitive effects. So in the neuromodeling and interface lab, which is building that memory prosthesis, we're currently in the process of conducting qualitative interviews with trial participants, as well as individuals with mild cognitive impairment and individuals with biomarkers for Alzheimer's disease, in order to develop a qualitative tool that allows us to gain a grasp on these intended cognitive effects, which could generally be used in this sort of growing field of cognitive neurostimulation. And so, yeah, I'd like to thank the people in the lab that really helped with this. Dong Song is the principal investigator, and I couldn't have done this without the support of some great high school students, Kevin Rao and Miranda Zhang, and external collaborators from the University of Washington, particularly Aaron Klein. So yeah, thank you for listening, and that's all
right. Thanks for the wonderful talk, Garrett. So as we are waiting for questions, I have a more like I would say, like, how would we even start asking this question to like the patients? So for example, like what would be like, is there any, do you think it would be like questionnaires, or should it be like tasks that we actually assess if there are changes? So what would you like suggest? Like, is there a questionnaire that we could use?
Yeah, so for at least the literature review, we focused on qualitative responses. So that would not include things like generalized memory tasks or other cognitive tasks in the clinic. We sort of steered away from those. Surveys are also notoriously difficult to get any sort of deeper response, and it's generally sort of leading questions that may or may not allow for really in-depth, open-ended responses. So I would say that the suggestion there would be semi-structured qualitative interviewing. Yeah, so getting the direct responses of patients, asking about any sort of changes in their cognitive processes, more directed at sort of specifics like language and memory.
Got it. And I think you briefly touched it before, but I didn't quite grasp it. Like, was there any number that you could tell that the patients were expecting cognitive improvements, like an expected outcome of the treatment, or did you find any?
Yeah, so that's slightly showed on this graph, or the top figure. So there's one summary of an enhanced effect or expectation from patients themselves.
Okay. So this was expectation, not necessarily the outcome that was.
Yeah, I would say that we didn't find any enhancive effects that were actually like reported as testimonials from patients. Yeah.
Okay. And so just wanted to let the attendees know you can always ask questions and we can bring you on screen. As we are waiting, I have one more question. So was there any, like, I'm curious if how much of this is actually from, say, deep brain stimulation and how much is from like non-invasive brain stimulation?
Yeah, so there was a pretty heavy weighting towards DBS. So the 3 devices that we actually did gather in this literature review, or that were the results of the sort of screening process, were deep brain stimulation, transcranial direct current stimulation, and 1 bidirectional brain-computer interface study. The bidirectional study was actually not included in the cognitive effects, so there was no cognitive effects reported there or asked about. And I think transcranial direct current stimulation was about 1/3 of the studies, and DBS composed the other 2/3.
Okay, nice. Yeah, Jorge, please unmute yourself and ask a question.
Great, thank you. Great work, Garrett. I'm curious about the caregivers and the family bars in this plot. It seems like for some of these things, like placebo effects or like heightened expectations of getting better, can get in the way of patients and providers. But it seems to me that caregivers and family could be a better witness of like actual improvement. And I'm wondering if this is something that can be enhanced, or if for example, I wonder why there are like expectations bars for caregivers and family. Like, do you think they are not asked before the treatment what they're expecting, or because I think that will be like valuable information. Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. I think that the patients and caregivers, or the patients' families and their caregivers, are very important repositories of knowledge about what actually happens in daily life. I mean, if brain stimulation modifies cognition, then to some extent, the reports of patients are slightly suspect. They may be tinged by the stimulation itself. And so caregivers and family members can report on changes in behavior that the patient may not themselves be aware of. Yeah, what I would say is just, yeah, I think it's important that it be considered in the future. I'm not 100% sure how it can itself be enhanced, but I think it's, yeah, certainly worthy of note. And yeah, in this, it's largely reports of worsened cognition as well. So I explicitly remember a spouse of a patient mentioning that her husband felt like one of her pupils at school. Like, she's a school teacher, and he felt like he was just like one of the distracted students all the time. And so that was interesting. But I think to some extent, it's a little fuzzy still. And I think there needs to be a lot more work done there.
This is getting a little detailed, but were there any instances where you found like conflicting reports? So if, for example, you see that public, there were 2 reports, and were they the same from someone who had a family or a caregiver give a rating?
Sorry, can you repeat that question a little bit? Are we comparing public and caregivers? Is that?
Yeah, so are they from the same, is it about the same study? Is it from the same study that you?
Oh, okay. Yeah. So if there was a mixed study, they were largely healthcare providers and caregivers and family members or patients. The public itself was only queried in one of the research articles. And so there really wasn't a mixing between those like public and researchers were 2 sort of independent groups that were characterized, and then the others were sort of connected together in some cases.
Okay, got it. Yep. Okay. If you have no more questions, let's thank Garrett again, and we'll bring on our next speaker, Jorge Morales from Johns Hopkins University.